The Earth of 130,000 years ago bore little resemblance to the frozen wasteland it would become. During this period, known as the Eemian Interglacial, our planet basked in warmth that exceeded even modern temperatures. Global mean temperatures ran 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, higher than those recorded in the 21st century, transforming vast swaths of the Northern Hemisphere into lush, temperate landscapes where ice sheets had previously dominated. This thermal maximum represented the culmination of a gradual warming trend that had been building for millennia, driven by orbital configurations that concentrated solar radiation in the Arctic during summer months. The elevated temperatures triggered massive ice sheet collapse across Greenland and portions of Antarctica. Meltwater cascaded into the world's oceans, raising sea levels between 4 and 6 meters above present-day measurements. Coastal regions that would later emerge as dry land during glacial periods remained submerged beneath warm, shallow seas. The Mediterranean expanded beyond its current boundaries, while the North Sea stretched further inland across what would become the British Isles and northern European plains. These higher sea levels created archipelagos where continuous land masses exist today, fundamentally altering migration routes for both animals and early human populations. The Scandinavian peninsula, freed from its burden of glacial ice, experienced rapid geological rebound as the Earth's crust adjusted to the removal of tremendous weight. Forests of oak, elm and hazel colonised territories that had been locked under kilometres of ice for tens of thousands of years. The Baltic region transformed into a complex system of islands and straits, with dense woodlands extending far beyond the Arctic Circle. Even northern Siberia supported extensive boreal forests, creating continuous woodland corridors that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Within this warmer world, early human populations occupied distinct geographical niches that reflected both environmental opportunities and the evolutionary trajectories of different hominin species. Homo sapiens, having emerged in Africa during the preceding interglacial period, had established robust populations across the African continent. These communities demonstrated sophisticated tool-making capabilities, producing blade technologies and composite implements that represented significant advances over earlier Acheulean traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point reveals populations engaged in symbolic behaviour, creating ochre-based pigments and crafting ornamental objects that suggest complex social structures and abstract thinking. The distribution of these African populations reflected the continent's diverse ecological zones during the Eemian. The Sahara, periodically transformed into a green corridor during previous interglacials, began experiencing increased aridity as orbital cycles shifted. However, extensive river systems still drain northward through what would later become desert, supporting scattered communities of hunter-gatherers who exploited both aquatic and terrestrial resources. Lake Chad expanded to roughly 10 times its modern size, creating a vast inland sea that supported hippos, crocodiles, and diverse fish populations. These water bodies served as focal points for human settlement, providing reliable resources and serving as corridors for population movement between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean basin. Meanwhile, across Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthal populations had achieved remarkable success in colonizing diverse environments. These robust hominins, perfectly adapted to fluctuating climatic conditions, established communities from the Iberian Peninsula to the Altai Mountains. Their settlements clustered around cave systems and rock shelters that provided protection from seasonal weather variations, while their sophisticated tool industries enabled exploitation of both large game and plant resources. Neanderthal sites from this period reveal evidence of controlled fire use, systematic hunting strategies, and even rudimentary symbolic behaviour, including the collection of unusual stones and shells. The Neanderthal populations of the Eemian displayed remarkable regional adaptations. In the Mediterranean regions, they developed specialized techniques for hunting deer, wild boar, and smaller game in dense woodland environments. Their lithic technology emphasized versatile scrapers and points suitable for processing both meat and plant materials. Northern European groups, facing more variable seasonal conditions, created more robust toolkits designed for processing large mammals and extracting maximum nutrition from available resources. These populations demonstrated intimate knowledge of their local environments, timing their movements to exploit seasonal abundance of nuts, berries, and migrating animals. The megafauna communities of the Eemian period represented some of the most spectacular animal assemblages in Earth's history. Straight-tusked elephants, massive creatures standing over 4 meters at the shoulder, roam the temperate forests of Europe and Asia. These giants, larger than modern African elephants, possessed enormous curved tusks that could exceed 3 meters in length. Their presence shaped entire ecosystems, creating clearings in dense woodlands and maintaining open grasslands through their feeding behaviours. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of these elephants' interactions with human populations, including possible hunting sites where Neanderthal groups may have scavenged or actively pursued these massive prey animals. European river systems during the Eemian supported populations of hippos that had expanded far beyond their modern African range. These semi-aquatic giants wallowed in the Thames, Rhine, and other major waterways, creating muddy banks and shallow pools that supported diverse aquatic ecosystems. The presence of hippos in Britain and northern Europe required year-round water temperatures significantly warmer than modern conditions, indicating the profound climatic differences of this interglacial period. Alongside these aquatic giants, European rivers supported straight-tusked elephants that came to drink and bathe, creating dynamic interactions between terrestrial and aquatic megafauna. The mammalian diversity of Eemian Europe rivaled that of modern African savannas. Giant deer, with antler spreads exceeding 3 meters, inhabited the forest margins and open woodlands. These impressive cervids, also known as Irish elk despite their widespread distribution, represented the pinnacle of antler evolution, with males carrying elaborate branched structures that served both as weapons and displays of genetic fitness. Aurochs, the massive wild cattle that would later give rise to domestic breeds, formed herds that moved seasonally between woodland pastures and river valleys. These powerful bovids stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with bulls displaying aggressive territorial behaviors that shaped grazing patterns across the landscape. Cave bears, substantially larger than modern brown bears, occupied extensive cave systems throughout Europe. These massive ursids, with skulls exceeding 75 centimeters in length, demonstrated specialized adaptations for plant-based diets, though they retained the physical capabilities for occasional carnivory. Their cave systems often overlapped with Neanderthal occupation sites, creating complex relationships between human and bear populations that range from competition for shelter to possible hunting interactions. The predator guilds of the Eemian included species that would become extinct before the end of the glacial cycle. Cave lions, larger than modern African lions, hunted in the open woodlands and grassland margins. These powerful cats possessed robust builds adapted for taking down megafauna prey, including young elephants, rhinos, and large deer. Spotted hyenas maintained extensive populations across Europe, their bone-crushing jaws enabling them to exploit carcasses left by both human hunters and large predators. The presence of these African-adapted species in European ecosystems underscores the dramatically different climatic conditions of the interglacial period. Beneath this biological abundance, astronomical forces were already beginning to shift toward configurations that would trigger the next glacial period. The Earth's orbital parameters, governed by complex interactions between eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, were entering phases that would reduce summer insolation in the northern hemisphere. Blankovich cycles, named after the Serbian mathematician who calculated their climatic effects, operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years, creating predictable patterns of glacial and interglacial periods. During the Eemian maximum, orbital eccentricity had created conditions that amplified seasonal contrasts in solar radiation. The Earth's elliptical orbit brought the planet closest to the Sun during Northern Hemisphere summer, maximizing the solar energy available for melting ice and maintaining warm temperatures. However, this configuration was gradually shifting as gravitational influences from Jupiter and other planets slowly altered the Earth's orbital characteristics. The obliquity cycle, reflecting changes in the tilt of Earth's rotational axis, was beginning its transition towards reduced axial tilt. Lower obliquity values decreased the seasonal contrast between summer and winter, particularly at high latitudes where ice sheets form. This reduction in summer warmth would prove crucial for ice sheet initiation, as snow and ice that accumulated during winter months would increasingly survive through the following summer seasons. Precession cycles, governing the timing of seasons relative to Earth's position in its elliptical orbit, were shifting towards configurations that would place Northern Hemisphere summer at the point of greatest distance from the Sun. This astronomical arrangement would reduce the solar energy available for summer melting, creating conditions conducive to permanent snow accumulation in high latitude and high altitude regions. The combination of these orbital changes created a gradual cooling trend that became apparent in marine sediment records and ice core data from the later Eemian period. Ocean temperatures began their slow decline from interglacial maxima, while ice sheets in Greenland and northern Canada started accumulating mass for the first time in over 10,000 years. These changes proceeded almost imperceptibly on human timescales, but they represented the beginning of a climatic transition that would reshape the entire planet over the following millennia. The transition from the Eemian warmth occurred with deceptive gradualness. Ocean surface temperatures dropped by fractions of degrees each millennium, while winter snows lingered progressively longer in the mountains of Scandinavia and the Canadian Arctic. What began as subtle shifts in seasonal patterns accelerated into dramatic environmental transformation as orbital mechanics drove the planet toward its next major glaciation. By 115,000 years ago, permanent ice fields had established themselves across northern Quebec and Labrador, marking the nascent stages of what would become the Laurentide ice sheet. The initial accumulation zones formed in the highlands of eastern Canada, where elevation combined with latitude to create conditions favourable for year-round ice retention. The Torn Gap Mountains and the Labrador Plateau became focal points for snow accumulation as moisture-laden air masses from the Atlantic deposited heavy snowfall across these elevated regions. Unlike the temporary winter snow cover of the Eemian, these deposits persisted through increasingly cool summers, gradually compacting into dense firn and eventually glacial ice. The transformation from loose snow to solid ice occurred through a process of repeated melting and refreezing, creating layers of dense material that reflected sunlight and further cooled local temperatures. As ice thickness increased, the accumulated mass began flowing outward under its own weight, following the natural topography of the Canadian Shield. The ancient Precambrian bedrock, worn smooth by previous glaciations, provided ideal surfaces for ice sheet expansion. Valleys carved by earlier ice advances channeled the growing glaciers southward and westward, creating ice streams that moved at rates of several meters per year. These early ice flows carved distinctive grooves and striations into the underlying bedrock, evidence that remains visible across the Canadian landscape today. The mechanics of ice sheet growth followed predictable physical principles. As ice thickness exceeded several hundred meters, the immense weight compressed the lower layers, creating conditions where ice behaved as a viscous fluid. This plastic deformation allowed the ice mass to spread horizontally, extending its margins far beyond the original accumulation zones. The advancing ice front bulldozed loose sediments, incorporating rock debris that enhanced the glacier's erosive power. Moraines of mixed stone and soil accumulated at the ice margins, creating distinctive landforms that mark the maximum extent of glacial advances. Simultaneously across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet began its own dramatic expansion from nucleation centres in the Norwegian mountains. The Scandus Mountains, running along the spine of the Scandinavian peninsula, provided the initial accumulation zones where persistent snowfields gradually transformed into active glaciers. Unlike the relatively uniform topography of the Canadian Shield, Scandinavia's complex mountain geography created multiple ice domes that eventually coalesced into a single massive ice sheet. The Fennoscandian ice expansion followed the natural drainage basins of northern Europe, with major ice streams flowing down the Baltic Depression and across the North European plain. The advancing ice encountered less resistance than its North American counterpart, as the relatively low-lying terrain of northern Europe offered few topographic barriers to glacial advance. Ice streams carved deep valleys through the crystalline bedrock of Finland and Sweden, creating the distinctive fjord landscapes that characterize modern Scandinavia. The growth of these continental ice sheets triggered cascading environmental changes that extended far beyond their immediate margins. The most dramatic consequence involved global sea level, which began dropping as increasing quantities of water became locked in terrestrial ice. The relationship between ice volume and sea level operates through simple mass balance. Every cubic kilometre of ice represents approximately 900,000 cubic metres of water removed from the ocean system. As the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets expanded to cover millions of square kilometres with ice hundreds of metres thick, the cumulative water withdrawal created unprecedented exposure of continental shelves. By 100,000 years ago, sea levels had dropped approximately 40 metres below modern levels, exposing vast areas of previously submerged terrain. The English Channel began emerging as a broad river valley, with the Thames and Rhine systems converging into a single drainage network that flowed northward across the exposed Doggerland plain. This emergent landscape, stretching from eastern England to the Netherlands and beyond, created a continuous land bridge that connected the British Isles to continental Europe for the first time in over 100,000 years. The exposed Doggerland region developed into a complex ecosystem of rivers, lakes and grasslands that supported diverse plant and animal communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that this land bridge became a crucial corridor for both animal migrations and human population movements. The terrain consisted primarily of fertile alluvial deposits left by retreating seas, creating ideal conditions for the establishment of grassland communities that could support large herbivore populations. Even more significant for human migration patterns was the emergence of Beringia, the land bridge connecting Asia and North America across what is now the Bering Strait. As sea levels dropped beyond 50 metres below present levels, the shallow waters of the Bering Sea retreated, exposing a landmass nearly 2,000 kilometres wide at its maximum extent. This exposed terrain, technically a continuation of the Siberian and Alaskan continental shelves, created an unbroken pathway between the old and new worlds. Beringia represented more than a simple land bridge. It constituted a distinct biogeographical province with its own characteristic flora and fauna. The region supported extensive grassland communities dominated by sedges, grasses and herbs that could tolerate the harsh continental climate. These plant communities, adapted to cold temperatures and strong seasonal variations, provided the foundation for what ecologists term the mammoth steppe ecosystem that would dominate much of northern Eurasia and northwestern North America throughout the glacial period. The mammoth steppe represented a unique ecosystem without modern analogues, characterized by extremely high productivity despite harsh climatic conditions. The plant communities consisted primarily of cold-adapted grasses and herbs that grew in dense mats, creating a continuous carpet of vegetation across vast areas. Unlike modern tundra, which supports relatively low animal biomass, the mammoth steppe sustained enormous populations of large herbivores through a combination of high plant productivity and efficient nutrient cycling. Woolly mammoths emerged as the dominant megafauna of these grassland systems, their massive size and specialized adaptations making them perfectly suited to exploit the abundant plant resources. These impressive elephantids, standing up to 3.5 meters at the shoulder, possessed dense undercoats of fine wool covered by long guard hairs that provided insulation against temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Their curved tusks, reaching lengths of 4 meters in mature males, served multiple functions, including snow removal, bark stripping, and intraspecific combat during mating seasons. The mammoth's feeding behavior shaped entire landscapes through their impact on vegetation communities. A single adult mammoth consumed 300 kilograms of plant material daily, requiring constant movement across the landscape to avoid overgrazing any particular area. Their feeding patterns created a mosaic of habitats, with heavily grazed areas alternating with less disturbed zones that supported different plant species. The animal's massive feet, measuring over 40 centimeters in diameter, compacted snow and soil, creating pathways that other animals followed and that influenced drainage patterns across the landscape. Woolly rhinoceros shared these grassland habitats with mammoths, though their feeding strategies focused more heavily on woody browse and coarser vegetation. These massive ungulates, weighing up to 3,000 kilograms, possess distinctive flattened horns adapted for sweeping snow away from buried vegetation. Their thick, shaggy coats provided insulation comparable to that of mammoths, while their broad, flat feet distributed weight effectively across soft ground and snow. The presence of both mammoth and rhinoceros populations in the same habitats suggests remarkable productivity in these ancient grassland systems. The establishment of periglacial environments extended far beyond the immediate ice sheet margins, creating distinctive landscapes characterized by permanently frozen subsoil and seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. These periglacial zones, extending hundreds of kilometers south of the ice margins, supported unique geological processes that shaped terrain in ways visible across modern landscapes. Frost wedging split bedrock along natural fractures, creating extensive tailor slopes and boulder fields. Solifluction, the slow-down slope movement of water-saturated soil during brief summer thaws, created distinctive lobed and terraced landforms. The development of permafrost across vast areas of northern Eurasia and North America fundamentally altered hydrological systems. Surface water could not penetrate the permanently frozen subsoil, creating extensive wetlands and shallow lakes during summer months. These water bodies supported diverse aquatic ecosystems and provided critical habitat for migratory waterfowl and other wildlife. The permafrost also preserved organic material with exceptional fidelity, creating the fossil deposits that provide modern scientists with detailed information about Pleistocene ecosystems. During this period of environmental transformation, human populations faced unprecedented challenges and opportunities. Homo sapiens communities in Africa continued developing increasingly sophisticated technologies and social systems, while also beginning tentative expansions beyond their continental homeland. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kafse and School, caves in the Levant documents the presence of anatomically modern humans in the eastern Mediterranean region by approximately 100,000 years ago. These early human expansions into the Levant represented significant achievements in adaptation and technology. The migrants possessed advanced lithic technologies that included carefully prepared blade cores and composite tools incorporating multiple materials. Their toolkits demonstrated remarkable standardization across different sites, suggesting well-developed cultural traditions and possibly symbolic communication systems that enable the transmission of complex technical knowledge. The Levantine populations encountered environmental conditions markedly different from their African origins. The region experienced increased aridity as global cooling reduced monsoon strength and altered precipitation patterns. However, the eastern Mediterranean retained sufficient moisture to support woodland and grassland communities that could sustain human populations. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of systematic hunting strategies targeting deer, gazelles, and other medium-sized game, along with intensive exploitation of plant resources including wild cereals and legumes. More significantly, these expanding Homo sapiens populations encountered established Neanderthal communities that had occupied the Levant for tens of thousands of years. The archaeological record suggests complex interactions between these different human species, with evidence of both competition and possible technological exchange. Some sites show alternating layers of Neanderthal and modern human occupation, indicating that control of favourable locations shifted between populations over time. The Neanderthal populations of this period demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of changing environmental conditions. Their communities across Europe adapted to increasingly harsh winters and shortened growing seasons through technological innovations and behavioural modifications. Cold-adapted tool technologies emphasised efficient processing of animal resources, with specialised scrapers and knives designed for hide preparation and bone marrow extraction. These tools enabled Neanderthal groups to maximise nutritional return from hunting activities while also producing materials necessary for clothing and shelter construction. Neanderthal settlement patterns during the early glacial period reflected careful adaptation to seasonal resource availability. Many groups established base camps in cave systems that provided protection from harsh weather, while maintaining networks of temporary sites that enabled exploitation of seasonal resources. The distribution of these sites suggests sophisticated territorial systems and possibly coordinated hunting strategies that required complex social organisation and communication. The technological capabilities of both human species continued evolving in response to environmental pressures. Composite tools incorporating stone, bone, and organic materials became increasingly common, enabling more efficient resource exploitation. Evidence for controlled fire use expanded dramatically during this period, with hearth sites showing sophisticated understanding of fuel management and heat distribution. These technological advances proved crucial for survival in increasingly challenging climatic conditions. As ice sheets continued expanding and sea levels dropped toward their glacial minima, the stage was set for even more dramatic environmental changes and human adaptations that would characterize the height of the last glacial maximum. The gradual cooling that had characterized the early glacial period was about to be interrupted by one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in human history. Deep beneath the tropical forests of northern Sumatra, geological forces had been building toward an explosive climax that would dwarf any volcanic eruption witnessed by modern civilization. The Toba caldera, measuring approximately 100 kilometers in length and 60 kilometers in width, represented the surface expression of a massive magma chamber that had been accumulating molten rock for hundreds of thousands of years. The eruption that occurred around 74,000 years ago released an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma, making it roughly 5,000 times larger than the 1980 Mount Street Helens eruption and 100 times greater than the 1815 Tambora event that caused global climate disruption. The Toba event ranks as a VEI-8 supervolcanic eruption, the highest category on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, placing it among the most powerful geological events of the Quaternary period. The explosion ejected material with such force that volcanic debris reached altitudes exceeding 50 kilometers, penetrating deep into the stratosphere where it could circulate globally. The initial phases of the eruption likely began with precursory earthquakes and smaller explosive events that would have been terrifying to any human populations within hundreds of kilometers. However, The main eruptive sequence unleashed destruction on a scale difficult to comprehend. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, ash and rock fragments travelling at speeds exceeding 100 km per hour, swept across the landscape in all directions from the eruption site. These deadly currents maintain temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius and possess the density and momentum to surmount topographic barriers hundreds of meters high. Within a radius of 200 kilometers from the eruption center, virtually all life was instantly obliterated. The pyroclastic flows carbonized forests, boiled rivers, and buried the landscape under deposits reaching thicknesses of 600 meters in some locations. The city of Medan, had it existed, would have been buried under 600 meters of volcanic material. The flows extended across the Strait of Malacca, reaching the Malay Peninsula and covering areas that would later become modern Malaysia under meters of volcanic debris. The atmospheric injection of volcanic material created immediate and dramatic climatic effects across the entire planet. Fine ash particles, measuring less than 2 micrometers in diameter, remained suspended in the stratosphere for several years, creating a global veil that reduced incoming solar radiation by an estimated 90% depending on latitude. This massive reduction in solar energy reaching Earth's surface triggered what volcanologists term a volcanic winter, a period of sustained global cooling that lasted between 6 and 10 years according to various climate models. Temperature reconstructions based on ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica suggest that global mean temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius during the immediate aftermath of the eruption. However, regional variations were far more extreme, with some areas experiencing temperature deviations of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius below normal conditions. The Northern Hemisphere, already experiencing gradual cooling due to orbital cycles, faced particularly severe temperature reductions that pushed many regions toward conditions approaching those of the last glacial maximum. The climatic disruption extended far beyond simple temperature reduction. The massive injection of sulfur compounds into the stratosphere created sulfuric acid aerosols that not only blocked sunlight, but also altered precipitation patterns across the globe. Monsoon systems, crucial for supporting agricultural and natural ecosystems across Asia and Africa, weakened dramatically or failed entirely for several consecutive years. The Indian subcontinent, normally receiving life-sustaining seasonal rains, experienced severe drought conditions that persisted long after the volcanic ash had settled. These environmental catastrophes had profound implications for human populations that were already struggling to adapt to the challenges of an increasingly cold world. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis, first proposed by anthropologist Stanley Ambrose in 1998, suggests that the volcanic winter created conditions so severe that Homo sapiens populations were reduced to perhaps 1,000, 10,000 breeding individuals. This proposed demographic bottleneck would represent the closest approach to extinction that our species has ever experienced. Genetic evidence supporting this hypothesis comes from studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome variations in modern human populations. The relatively low genetic diversity observed in contemporary Homo sapiens, particularly when compared to other primate species, suggests that our species passed through a severe population bottleneck sometime between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. The timing of this genetic constriction corresponds closely with the Toba eruption, leading some researchers to propose direct causation between the volcanic catastrophe and near-human extinction. The bottleneck hypothesis gains additional support from the observation that all non-African human populations appear to descend from a relatively small founding group that expanded from Africa sometime after 70,000 years ago. This pattern suggests that earlier human expansions into Asia and the Middle East, documented at sites like Kafsa and School, may have been terminated by the Toba catastrophe. The populations that survived would have been primarily African groups, that were geographically distant from the eruption centre and possibly better adapted to variable environmental conditions. However, archaeological evidence from the Indian subcontinent has begun to challenge the most extreme versions of the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. Excavations at Jwalapuram in the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh have revealed stone tool assemblages both below and above the Toba ash layer, suggesting continuity of human occupation through the volcanic crisis. The archaeological sequence at Jwalapuram shows Middle Paleolithic stone tools in deposits immediately underlying the Toba ash, followed by similar tool traditions in the overlying sediments. The Jwalapuram evidence indicates that human populations in India possessed sufficient technological and social capabilities to survive the immediate effects of the Toba eruption. The stone tool assemblages include sophisticated blade technologies and prepared core techniques that demonstrate advanced lithic skills. The similarity between pre- and post-Toba tool traditions suggests that local human populations maintained their cultural knowledge and technical capabilities despite the environmental catastrophe. Additional archaeological sites across India have yielded similar evidence for human survival through the Toba event. Excavations at Darbar in the Middle Sun Valley of northern India have produced stone tool sequences that span the Toba ash horizon, again suggesting population continuity rather than local extinction. These sites preserve evidence of systematic tool production, using carefully prepared cores and standardized reduction sequences that indicate sophisticated cultural traditions. The technological capabilities demonstrated at these sites suggest that human populations have developed adaptive strategies sufficient to cope with severe environmental stress. The tool assemblages include specialized implements for processing plant materials, indicating that these communities had developed broad-spectrum subsistence strategies that could exploit diverse resource bases. This technological flexibility may have been crucial for survival during the prolonged environmental disruption following the Toba eruption. The survival of human populations in India during the Toba crisis required remarkable adaptations to drastically altered environmental conditions. The volcanic ash fall across the subcontinent reached thicknesses of several centimetres, sufficient to disrupt plant communities and contaminate water sources. The reduction in solar radiation would have severely impacted plant productivity, reducing the availability of both wild plant foods and the herbivore populations that depended on them. Archaeological evidence suggests that surviving human groups adapted through increased mobility and dietary diversification. Sites from this period show evidence for exploitation of underground storage organs, tubers, and roots that would have been less affected by surface ash deposition. The processing tools found at these sites include specialized grinding implements that may have been used to remove volcanic ash from plant materials or to process foods that required extensive preparation to remove toxic compounds. The demographic impact of the Toba eruption extended beyond immediate mortality to include long-term reproductive consequences. Volcanic ash inhalation would have caused severe respiratory problems, particularly affecting children and elderly individuals. The reduction in food availability would have led to malnutrition and increased susceptibility to disease. These factors combined to create sustained population decline that continued for generations after the initial eruption. Despite these challenges, the genetic evidence suggests that some human populations not only survived, but eventually thrived in the post-Toba environment. The mitochondrial DNA lineages that expanded from Africa after 70,000 years ago show patterns consistent with rapid population growth from small founding groups. This demographic expansion indicates that surviving populations possessed adaptive advantages that enable them to exploit the recovering post-volcanic environment effectively. The recovery patterns following the Toba catastrophe reveal the remarkable resilience of both human populations and natural ecosystems. Climate records from ice cores and marine sediments show that global temperatures began returning to pre-eruption levels within a decade of the event. However, regional recovery varied significantly, with some areas experiencing prolonged disruption, while others rebounded relatively quickly. Vegetation communities across the affected regions showed differential recovery rates, depending on local environmental conditions and the severity of initial damage. Areas that received heavy ashfall experienced delayed ecological recovery, as soils required time to develop sufficient fertility to support plant growth. However, the volcanic ash also provided mineral nutrients that ultimately enhanced soil fertility once the initial toxic effects had been ameliorated through weathering and leaching. The megafauna populations of Asia faced severe challenges during and after the Toba eruption. Large herbivores dependent on extensive grassland and woodland habitats suffered massive mortality as vegetation communities collapsed under the combined effects of ash burial and reduced solar radiation. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of increased human exploitation of stressed animal populations, suggesting that surviving human groups may have benefited temporarily from the availability of weakened prey animals. However, the long-term effects on megafauna populations were severe and persistent. Many large mammal species that had thrived in the pre-Toba environment never fully recovered their previous population levels. The disruption of migration routes and breeding grounds created lasting impacts on species that required large territories and stable environmental conditions. These effects contributed to the broader pattern of megafauna extinction that characterized the later Pleistocene period. The Toba catastrophe also had significant impacts on human technological and cultural evolution. The severe environmental stress may have accelerated the development of more sophisticated technologies and social systems necessary for survival in unpredictable conditions. Archaeological evidence from post-Toba sites shows increased standardization of tool technologies and evidence for long-distance exchange networks that may have developed as adaptive responses to resource scarcity and environmental uncertainty. The social implications of surviving such a catastrophic event likely included increased cooperation between groups and the development of more complex information-sharing systems. The knowledge necessary for identifying safe water sources, locating edible plants that were not contaminated with volcanic ash, and predicting weather patterns would have become extremely valuable. Communities that could effectively share and preserve such information would have possessed significant survival advantages. As the immediate effects of the Toba eruption began to subside and global climate systems stabilized, the surviving human populations found themselves in a world that had been fundamentally transformed. The demographic bottleneck created by the volcanic winter had eliminated many local populations and cultural traditions, but it had also created opportunities for the survivors to expand into previously occupied territories. The stage was set for the remarkable human expansion that would characterize the following millennia, as small groups of survivors began the process of recolonizing vast areas of Asia and eventually expanding into previously uninhabited continents. The survivors of the Toba catastrophe emerged into a world fundamentally altered by volcanic winter. Yet within several millennia, these resilient populations would accomplish the most remarkable expansion in human history. The demographic bottleneck that had nearly extinguished Homo sapiens created unexpected opportunities for the surviving groups, who found themselves inheriting vast territories previously occupied by populations that had perished during the climatic crisis. These survivors possessed not only the genetic foundation for all future human populations outside Africa, but also the technological sophistication and adaptive flexibility that would enable them to colonize environments no hominin had ever successfully inhabited. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Middle East and South Asia reveals that by 60,000 years ago, human populations had not only recovered from the Toba catastrophe, but had begun developing new migration strategies that would carry them far beyond their ancestral African homeland. The stone tool assemblages from this period demonstrate remarkable technological innovations, including the systematic production of blade tools that were lighter sharper, and more versatile than earlier technologies. These implements required sophisticated understanding of stone fracture mechanics and represented a significant advance in efficiency of raw material use. The recovery populations showed evidence of enhanced social organization and information sharing networks that may have developed as adaptive responses to the environmental uncertainties of the post-Toba world. Sites from the Levant and Arabian Peninsula preserve evidence of standardized tool production techniques that suggest widespread cultural communication across vast distances. The similarity of lithic technologies found at sites separated by thousands of kilometers indicates either direct population movement or extensive trade and cultural exchange networks that facilitated the rapid spread of technological innovations. The primary route for human expansion out of Africa during this period followed the southern coastal corridor, taking advantage of the dramatically lowered sea levels that characterized the glacial world. As continental ice sheets continued locking up oceanic water, sea levels had dropped more than 60 meters below modern levels, exposing vast areas of previously submerged continental shelf. The Red Sea, normally a significant barrier to movement between Africa and Arabia, had narrowed to a strait less than 4 kilometers wide at its southern end, creating a crossing point that required only rudimentary watercraft to navigate. The exposed coastlines of the Arabian Peninsula and Indian Ocean provided a continuous pathway that human populations could follow eastward, without encountering the harsh interior deserts that had previously limited movement. These coastal zones retained sufficient moisture from oceanic influences to support woodland and grassland communities that could sustain migrating human groups. Archaeological sites along this route, though many now submerged beneath rising post-glacial seas, preserve evidence of systematic exploitation of both terrestrial and marine resources. The populations following the southern route demonstrated remarkable technological adaptations for coastal environments. Shell middens from sites in Oman and the Persian Gulf region contain evidence of sophisticated marine resource exploitation, including systematic collection of shellfish, capture of nearshore fish species, and possibly even primitive forms of aquaculture. The tool assemblages from these sites include specialized implements for processing marine resources, including shell scrapers and composite fishing equipment that represent significant innovations in subsistence technology. Genetic evidence from modern populations provides crucial insights into the timing and scale of these early migrations. Mitochondrial DNA lineages found in contemporary Asian and Australian populations trace back to founding groups that left Africa between 65,000 and 55,000 years ago. The relatively low genetic diversity within these lineages suggests that the founding populations were quite small, possibly consisting of only a few hundred individuals who successfully established themselves outside Africa and subsequently expanded to populate entire continents. The Y chromosome evidence tells a similar story, with the major haplogroups found in non-African populations deriving from a common ancestor who lived approximately 60,000 years ago. The geographic distribution of these genetic lineages traces the pathways of early human expansion, with the earliest branches found in populations along the proposed southern coastal route through Arabia and South Asia. The genetic data suggests rapid population growth following successful establishment outside Africa, with founding groups expanding exponentially as they encountered virgin territories rich in unexploited resources. The most remarkable achievement of these early migrants was their successful colonization of Australia, which required crossing significant water barriers even during periods of maximum sea level lowering. The journey from the Southeast Asian mainland to Australia involved navigating at least 90 kilometres of open ocean, a distance that required sophisticated watercraft and navigation skills. Archaeological evidence from sites like Majed Bebe in northern Australia documents human presence by approximately 65,000 years ago, making this the earliest confirmed evidence of modern human occupation outside the Afro-Eurasian landmass. The watercraft necessary for reaching Australia would have required advanced understanding of marine construction techniques and materials. While no direct archaeological evidence of these early boats has survived, ethnographic studies of traditional watercraft construction in the region provide insights into possible technologies. Bamboo rafts lashed with plant fibres could achieve sufficient size and stability for ocean crossings, while bark canoes sealed with tree resins offered alternative construction methods using readily available materials. The successful crossing required not only appropriate technology, but also sophisticated understanding of ocean currents, wind patterns, and celestial navigation. The human populations that reached Australia encountered a continent populated by megafauna species that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. Giant marsupials, including Diprotodon optatum, weighing over 2,000 kilograms, dominated the herbivore communities across much of the continent. These massive wombat-like creatures, standing 2 meters at the shoulder, possessed powerful claws adapted for digging and stripping bark from trees. Their feeding behaviour shaped entire ecosystems, creating clearings in dense woodland and maintaining grassland communities through their grazing activities. The Australian megafauna assemblage included predators equally impressive in scale. Megalania prisca, a monitor lizard reaching lengths of 7 meters, represented the apex predator in many ecosystems. These massive reptiles possessed venomous saliva and crushing bite forces that enabled them to take down prey as large as Diprotodon. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, combined the climbing abilities of modern koalas with the predatory adaptations of large cats, using enormous thumb claws to dispatch prey animals in dense woodland environments. The arrival of human populations in Australia coincided with dramatic environmental changes that would ultimately lead to the extinction of most megafauna species. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of human hunting activities targeting large animals, including butchery sites where Diprotodon remains show clear evidence of systematic processing. However, the relationship between human arrival and megafauna extinction remains complex, with climate change and habitat modification through human use of fire also contributing to ecosystem transformation. The Aboriginal populations that colonised Australia demonstrated remarkable adaptive capabilities, developing technologies and social systems suited to the continent's diverse environments. The stone tool traditions that developed in Australia show both continuity with earlier Asian technologies and significant innovations adapted to local raw materials and subsistence needs. The extensive use of ground-edge axes, rare in contemporary Asian assemblages, reflects adaptation to the woody plants that dominated many Australian environments. Fire management emerged as a crucial technology for Australian populations, enabling them to modify landscapes on continental scales. The systematic burning practices developed by Aboriginal groups created mosaic patterns of vegetation that increased habitat diversity and promoted the growth of useful plant species. Archaeological evidence suggests that these fire management systems were established within several millennia of initial colonisation, indicating rapid development of sophisticated landscape modification techniques. Meanwhile, across Eurasia, the expanding Homo sapiens populations encountered established Neanderthal communities that had occupied these regions for hundreds of thousands of years. The archaeological record from sites across Europe and Western Asia documents complex interactions between these different human species, ranging from competition for resources to technological exchange and genetic admixture. The Châtelperronian culture of southwestern France and northern Spain represents a particularly intriguing example of possible cultural interaction, with Neanderthal populations adopting blade technologies and symbolic behaviours characteristic of modern human traditions. Recent genetic studies have revealed that interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occurred multiple times and in multiple locations as the expanding modern human populations encountered Neanderthal groups. The Neanderthal DNA sequences found in contemporary non-African populations, typically comprising 1–3% of individual genomes, derive from a mixture of events that occurred primarily in the Middle East and Central Asia between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago. These genetic exchanges occurred despite significant biological and cultural differences between the species, suggesting that reproductive barriers were not absolute. The archaeological evidence for Homo sapiens-Neanderthal interactions includes sites where both species' tool technologies appear in the same stratigraphic sequences, indicating either direct contact or rapid succession of occupation. At Arcy-sur-Cure in France, Châtel-Perronian levels containing Neanderthal remains also preserve blade tools and bone ornaments typically associated with modern human cultures. This technological convergence suggests either independent innovation by Neanderthals or cultural transmission from contemporary Homo sapiens populations. The demographic impact of the Homo sapiens expansion on Neanderthal populations appears to have been severe and ultimately terminal. Radiocarbon dating of late Neanderthal sites across Europe shows a pattern of population contraction and eventual disappearance that correlates with the arrival of modern human populations in each region. The last confirmed Neanderthal sites, located in southern Spain and dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, represent the final refugia of a species that had successfully inhabited Europe for over 400,000 years. The technological innovations that characterized this period of human expansion included the development of sophisticated composite tools that combined multiple materials to achieve enhanced performance. Spear throwers, or atlatls, emerged during this period as mechanical devices that increased the velocity and accuracy of projectile weapons. These implements, carved from wood or antler and precisely balanced to optimize throwing mechanics, represented significant advances in hunting technology that enabled more efficient exploitation of large game animals. The systematic production of bone and antler tools became increasingly common during this period, with archaeological sites preserving evidence of specialized workshops where these materials were processed into finished implements. Bone needles, some with eyes so small they required magnification to thread, demonstrate remarkable precision in manufacturing and suggest the development of sophisticated clothing technologies. The ability to produce fitted garments would have been crucial for survival in the harsh climates that characterized much of Eurasia during this glacial period. Evidence for symbolic behavior and artistic expression becomes increasingly abundant in the archaeological record from this period. The cave paintings at sites like Chauvet in France, dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, represent some of the earliest confirmed examples of representational art in the archaeological record. These sophisticated images, depicting horses, rhinoceros, and other Ice Age animals with remarkable accuracy and artistic skill, indicate the presence of fully modern cognitive capabilities and symbolic communication systems. The production of personal ornaments and decorative objects expanded dramatically during this period, with archaeological sites preserving evidence of bead production, pendant manufacture, and body painting using ochre and other pigments. These symbolic materials often show evidence of long-distance transport, indicating extensive trade networks and cultural communication across vast distances. The standardization of ornament styles across broad geographic regions suggests the emergence of shared cultural identities and possibly complex social hierarchies. Musical instruments from this period include bone flutes with precisely drilled finger holes that demonstrate understanding of acoustic principles and mathematical relationships between tone production and hole spacing. The Hohlfels flute from Germany, dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, represents one of the earliest confirmed musical instruments and suggests that complex cultural expressions were well-established components of human society by this time. The settlement patterns that emerged during this period of expansion show evidence of increasing social complexity and territorial organization. Base camps with evidence of long-term occupation appear alongside networks of smaller sites that suggest seasonal mobility patterns adapted to resource availability. The distribution of these sites indicates sophisticated understanding of landscape ecology and resource scheduling that enabled human populations to exploit diverse environments efficiently. Storage technologies became increasingly sophisticated during this period, with archaeological evidence for constructed storage facilities and food processing installations that enabled populations to buffer against seasonal resource scarcity. The development of effective storage systems was crucial for survival in high-latitude environments where resource availability showed extreme seasonal variation. Sites from this period preserve evidence of systematic food processing activities, including the production of dried meat, processed plant foods, and possibly fermented beverages. By 26,500 years ago, the gradual accumulation of ice that had characterized the preceding millennia reached its ultimate expression. The continental ice sheets of North America and northern Europe had grown to dimensions that dwarfed anything witnessed by human civilization. The Laurentide ice sheet stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, covering virtually all of present-day Canada and extending deep into what would become the northern United States. At its thickest point over Hudson Bay, this massive ice dome reached elevations exceeding 3,000 meters above sea level, creating an ice mass so heavy that it depressed the underlying bedrock by several hundred meters. The sheer scale of these ice accumulations defied comprehension. The Laurentide ice sheet alone contained approximately 26.5 million cubic kilometers of ice, representing roughly 13 times the volume of all present-day ice sheets combined. The ice front extended southward to modern-day New York City, covering the sites of future Great Lakes under kilometers of glacial ice. West of the Great Lakes region, the ice margin swept southward through Minnesota and the Dakotas, reaching its maximum southern extent in Kansas and Missouri. This southern boundary represented the equilibrium point where annual ice accumulation balanced summer melting, creating a dynamic but relatively stable ice margin. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet had expanded to cover all of Scandinavia, extending across the Baltic Sea to encompass much of northern Russia and reaching southward into Germany and Poland. The ice dome centred over the Gulf of Bothnia achieved thicknesses comparable to those of the Laurentide sheet, with ice extending westward to cover the British Isles under a continuous glacial mass. The weight of this accumulated ice was so immense that Scandinavia continues to rebound upward today, rising at rates of several millimeters per year as the Earth's crust slowly adjusts to the removal of this ancient burden. The global impact of these continental ice sheets extended far beyond their immediate margins through their effect on sea level. With approximately 52 million cubic kilometers of water locked in terrestrial ice, global sea levels had dropped to 120 meters below present levels. This dramatic reduction exposed vast areas of continental shelf that had been submerged for tens of thousands of years. The English Channel had become a broad river valley, with the Thames and Rhine systems merging into a single drainage network that flowed northward across the exposed Doggerland Plain. This emergent landscape stretched from eastern England to the Netherlands and beyond, creating a landmass larger than modern-day Britain. The Bering Land Bridge had expanded to its maximum extent, creating a subcontinental landmass nearly 2,000 kilometres wide that connected Asia and North America. This exposed terrain, technically part of the Burundian Refugium, supported extensive grassland ecosystems that harboured some of the highest concentrations of large mammals in Earth's history. The continental shelves surrounding Southeast Asia had emerged as vast lowland plains, connecting the modern Indonesian archipelago into a single landmass called Sundaland that stretched from the Malay Peninsula to Java and Borneo. The atmospheric circulation patterns of the last glacial maximum bore little resemblance to modern weather systems. The massive ice sheets created their own weather, generating high-pressure systems that dominated regional climate patterns across much of the northern hemisphere. Cold, dry air masses flowed outward from the ice sheet centres, creating persistent anticyclonic conditions that brought clear skies but frigid temperatures to vast areas. The jet stream, displaced southward by the presence of the ice sheets, followed a more meridional path that brought Arctic air deep into temperate latitudes, while simultaneously drawing warm, moist air northward along the ice sheet margins. Global average temperatures during the last glacial maximum were approximately 4 to 7 degrees Celsius, colder than modern conditions, but regional variations were far more extreme. Areas immediately adjacent to ice sheet margins experienced temperature deviations of 15 to 20 degrees Celsius below present values, creating climatic conditions more severe than those found in modern Antarctica.